Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us for the second leg of our small business recovery road trip. Today we're going to be stopping in Minneapolis. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for making this timely event series possible. Across the country, even as the economy shows signs of recovery, many small firms are still struggling to make ends meet, hold things together, and minority-owned businesses are continuing to suffer on this front disproportionately. The picture is no different in Minneapolis, a city that is still reeling from the fallout of a global pandemic and a real reckoning with racial justice issues. What are local and national leaders doing to support small business in Minneapolis? And what support do minority-owned firms still urgently need? And what opportunities are being created to help these businesses not only recover, but blast through and survive long-term? We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers today, and to answer these questions, we're going to be talking to all of them in just a short bit. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillSmallBiz. That's SMALLBIZ. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, they say just refresh the page and all will be well. I don't believe it, but I hope it works out for you. Joining me now is Congresswoman Angie Craig of Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District. She's a real friend of the Hill and so happy to be talking to her again. Representative Craig is a member of the Small Business Committee and its Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Regulations. Congresswoman Craig, it's great to talk to you. What I want to give our audience an understanding of is what the scene is, what's unique about this moment in Minneapolis, small business, and the kind of demand that we get the equation moved in a different direction when it comes to inclusion, real inclusion in that. How are you approaching this, and what should our audience know?
Well, Steve, thank you so much for having me back to talk with you. And I think Minneapolis has its own leadership, but I think it's very much the same as what's happening in southeastern Minnesota in my congressional district, in the sense that the Paycheck Protection Program loan that we concluded on a bipartisan basis has really made a significant difference to small businesses and, of course, to minority-owned, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses throughout my district and throughout the state of Minnesota. We have some challenges ahead of us, though, when we think about things like the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which, of course, I was a strong advocate for and led members of Congress to tell the Biden administration and House leadership we didn't put enough money in that. There have been challenges with it because we said we needed close to $90 billion in that fund, and we only put $28.6 billion in the American Rescue Plan. We still have opportunity with programs like the Shuttered Venues Operators Grant Program, which frankly has had a tough rollout from the Small Business Administration. So I think we have got to continue to support America's small businesses. That has been the biggest difference as I've traveled my southeastern Minnesota district the last week and a half. It's really about how we saved a whole lot of small businesses, but that there's still plenty of lost revenue that I think we have a responsibility to help restaurants in particular recover.
Well, you know, when you talk about your district in southeast Minnesota, and I want to just go back to something because I think we rushed by it. Was there a problem that your legislation was trying to fix in terms of the PPP fairness? Because I don't think a lot of people are aware of what some of the challenges were for small businesses and what you did to help rectify that. Can you go a notch further?
Sure, absolutely, Steve. So as we know, the first round of PPP went to many larger businesses. That was not the intention of the program. And so we recognized pretty quickly that we had to rectify that with a second round of PPP. We had to make sure that those smaller businesses, that community banks really stepped in to help those small businesses. And at the end of the day, I think that a lot of those small businesses, minority-owned businesses, they've been in a position of not being first in line for a lot of these loans, just as a matter of not having the experience and the resources as a small business and as minority-owned businesses that some of the larger ones had. So I think there has been recognition that we need to make sure that equity is a part of this and that folks are getting access on an equal basis across these programs.
Representative Craig, do you think there's something we're not doing that we need to be doing either federally or the state and local level in terms of helping to, I don't know what to call it, I may not say this right, but sort of around the social contract of employers and workers? Because one of the really staggering things that's happening in the U.S. economy right now, I sort of feel things coming back, but we see labor shortages across the country. People, for a variety of reasons, are not where they need to be in terms of going back into some of these jobs. What is not connecting that needs? Because I talk to small businesses all around the country, and they say this is one of the biggest challenges they have. In addition to financing, it's getting workers.
Yeah, Steve, I'm hearing the same thing. And I heard someone say to me the other day, and I think it's an interesting concept, that perhaps American workers are going through a bit of a midlife crisis, especially in certain sectors. I actually had a restaurant owner that I visited say this to me in similar terms, that a lot of people through the course of this pandemic have reevaluated their lives. Do they want to come back and work in the restaurant or retail sector of our economy, the service sector of our economy? And it's more complicated than just, can I find workers? You know, for example, the businesses in my district that are paying $15 an hour, 18, 21, they're not having as much trouble finding workers. And so I do think there's an element of wages that's attached to this. And I also think that there's that it's complicated. It's a lot more complicated than the political talking points. For example, here in Minnesota, I'm here today, and the weather is beautiful, and the kids are out of school, and they have been learning from home for a period of months now. So if you got a few extra months, a couple of extra months of plus up on federal unemployment insurance versus sending your kids to childcare, where basically you're just going to eat up your wages if you do it, you would wait till the fall. So, you know, I talk to Neil Kashkari, the president of the Minneapolis Fed, on a regular basis, and his analysis is that workers are coming back, but they're reevaluating where in the workforce they want to come back into. I think this is going to be a longer term issue for us, Steve, where we really have to evaluate how are we going to put together the career skills and the trade skill opportunities to make sure workers have the skills for the jobs that are going to exist here in the future.
I should tell our audience that Neil Kashkari and the Minneapolis Fed is one of the most fascinating research institutions. So you want to learn about what's happening in microeconomics in this country. It's fascinating. So it's a good resource to go look at. But let me just, finally get another question, which I think is we're doing a little bit of a focus in addition, with a focus on businesses that are the minority-owned businesses, Black, Indigenous, Black and Brown-owned businesses. And I guess the question I have is that we saw in the pandemic disproportionate impact in Black and Brown communities, underserved communities, conservatives that had been on the fringes in the American economy for a long time, and efforts to try to change the game and wire that differently. And I think the administration has been trying very hard to send ambassadors, trusted people into communities to try to get over the resistance. What do you think we need to do by way of getting greater trust, getting greater inclusion for the Black and business community? It's not just money. I mean, there just must be some other parts of making all of that business community that your committee is responding to feel like they're part of the equation. And that's why I don't want to just have a talk about dollars. I want to have a talk about how do you build trust so that they know that they are equal players and contenders in the small business and their partnership with the public sector, if that makes sense.
Steve, I think you're right. And it's interesting because I was in one of my local small towns a few weeks ago talking about how they use the state and local government assistance. Of course, a lot of cities put together grants as well from those federal resources to their local small businesses. But more specifically, they were targeting Black and Indigenous and veteran and other owned businesses that haven't been on a level playing field here as you look at sort of the history of wealth building and business building in our nation. And specifically, they were sending folks out to make sure that those businesses know of the resources available to them. So I think you're exactly right. There's a cultural element to this. We tend to communicate sort of in broad terms, but sometimes in order to level the playing field, you really do have to have focus and commitment. And I'm so proud to see so many of our local communities recognizing that. And a lot of that work, it has to be done at the local level. Washington can't do that. We can provide, as you say, funding, but if you're going to go talk to Hispanic business owners, you got to go do that in native languages. And so you got to hire people to go out and help you do that in some of the communities around our country. And I'm really proud to see that recognition. The pandemic shined a light on the disparities in America. We've known they've existed in many communities, but it really did show that gap that exists, and we've got to work hard to make sure that we close the gap. I've been particularly focused on the health system as we look at just sort of the disparities in healthcare in our country, and this is just one area that really needs some intense focus.
Well, I know how seriously you take all these issues. I just want to remind our audience, this is Representative Angie Craig representing Minnesota's 2nd District. She's a member of the House Committee on Small Business, but also, and I love this, is that you are really kind of waving a red flag on the diminishing funds available in the Restaurant Revitalization Fund and other elements of this very uneven playing field in small businesses out there. So, Representative Craig, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.
My next guest is Senator Eric Pratt from the Minnesota State Senate. He serves as Assistant Majority Leader, and he chairs the Jobs and Economic Growth, Finance, and Policy Committee. And my understanding is that his district is in the Twin Cities metro area. We've been talking a little bit of Minneapolis. We're going to widen our aperture. We're going to talk about small business in the state, but I just want to kind of make sure that we make the alignment right. Senator, it's great to be with you today. Look, as we're talking about small business recovery, there's sort of I'm wondering if there's an inflection point where, usually businesses government want to get out of the way, they want to help, but we're a little bit in the nexus of talking about what do small businesses mostly need to succeed after a pretty traumatic 18 months. So as you go out and talk to your constituents, what do they want? What do they need?
Well, that's a great question, and thanks for having me today. I actually live in Congresswoman Craig's district. We share that. And so we talk to a lot of the same business owners, and the ones I talk to, through the pandemic and the restrictions that we had here in Minnesota, really needed financial support. We had taken their cash flow down to near zero in many cases. And so we needed to infuse them with working capital in order to keep the plywood out of their windows while their doors were shut. In fact, we did 3 rounds of grants. We did one in June. We came back again in December. And then just in this last budget cycle, we passed another $70 million in small business grants. So in total, we will have put in excess of $400 million into small business grants and support. It's really important. Many of our small business owners have their personal finances tied to their businesses. I had one restaurant owner who was worried he was going to lose his home because he had the second mortgage to keep his business open. But not only do I represent a small portion of the Twin Cities Metro, but as the Jobs Chair and as a state senator, it's my responsibility to look out for the health of the entire state, both Metro and Greater Minnesota.
Well, I really love the way you framed that because, it's clear that what hit us was on this scale, in my opinion, this is my opinion speaking, of the Great Depression. And so you had real systemic effects. Mm-hmm. The point is when you're growing out of that, we're talking, about small businesses. We're talking about also Black and Brown owned small businesses that have often not been, in the same track as other businesses, and how to get that equation right so that the bailouts don't become permanent, but businesses get the resources and direction and support they need. Senator, you authored this bill. I'd love to hear more about the Jobs and Economic Growth Bill that the Minnesota State Senate passed. So I assume it's not law yet, but it's on the way. What is that? How is that legislation responding, to that kind of inclusive picture of what businesses and jobs and that social contract for work out there?
Actually, it has become law, and it'll start
my
going
apologies.
into effect soon. It was
Congratulations.
It was our overall budget bill that we passed prior to July 1st. And, a couple of the highlights. We put together what we call the Main Street Revitalization Act. There's $70 million, as I mentioned, for direct grants to small businesses that range between $10,000 and $25,000. It's really meant to help businesses that were impacted directly by COVID and the COVID restrictions that we had. Moving it, again, being the third round, really trying to target those businesses that hadn't received support in the past. Then we had $80 million in, I want to say, capital projects. Again, statewide, understanding that we need to help small communities and large communities, quite honestly, rebuild some of the infrastructure. So if there's if there's issues in Minneapolis where we need to rebuild part of Lake Street, or if there's a child care center in greater Minnesota that needs help being built, or a factory, we can provide those incentives to help build those communities, build those jobs. One of the key portions of the Jobs Committee that I tend to look at is trying to remove the barriers to employment. And childcare, as I just mentioned, is one of the biggest barriers we have. And so we put $8 million this year and another $5 million next year into expanding childcare access.
Fascinating.
Improving the access and the sustainability so that we can get more people back to work.
Another thing, Senator, so first of all, congratulations on your bill passing. They didn't give me anything. I would have had champagne for you or something if I'd known that. But another dimension, later this week, I'm actually going to be talking with a guy named Aman Bhutani. And Bhutani is the CEO of a company called GoDaddy. And GoDaddy is the largest internet registration company and business support company in the U.S. in that digital space. And if there's one thing that we saw in the pandemic, is that we've all finally really gone from analog to digital, and all of this space is out there. And if you look at these studies that they've helped fund with the University of Iowa, Arizona State, and UCLA, you see a massive explosion of micro businesses and people doing businesses on the side, and that lots of in the area of minority-owned businesses, whatnot, folks creating new ventures, micro ventures on the side of what they're doing. And I've been interested in whether legislators like yourself have this on their radar screen, or is this a point of orientation in business formation and what's going on that we're not seeing? Because I'm sort of asking myself, well, there's some tough stories up here, but then when you look down here, there's actually a fascinating bit of innovation, and I'm wondering what we're doing by providing ways of digital support or incubators, or how to help folks have literacy on running businesses at that side. Because when we're talking about small businesses, many small businesses want to become big businesses. They micro business want to become big. And I'm just wondering if any of that is in the realm that you and your legislative colleagues are looking at.
Oh, absolutely. We recognize that, many of our small businesses aren't just competing with the guy across town. He's competing with people, with businesses in other states and quite honestly, other countries. What the digital economy has done is truly created a global economy, and our small Minnesota businesses need to be able to compete in that. One part of the jobs bill that we had was to leverage the federal money and put $70 million into expanding broadband access across the state, predominantly in rural Minnesota, where we have some real coverage holes. But even here in the metro, in my district, which is considered a suburban district, out in the townships, we have poor broadband coverage. So what does that mean? That means that I've got people that were working from home that couldn't work effectively or efficiently. I've got kids trying to go to school remotely that were having problems. And so I think broadband is the new interstate highway of the 21st century. But then we also have to look at how we compete with other states and other countries from our taxes. Minnesota is one of the highest tax states per capita in the nation. And in fact, we're ranked 9th overall in per capita state and local taxes, which becomes a real problem for our small businesses that are trying to grow to become big businesses.
Right. Well, you're in the Twin City metro area, but I'm sure that what happens in Minneapolis also matters to you. And Minneapolis has been kind of a zone where just a lot of tough stuff has happened over those last 18 months. And the whole equation of economic justice, economic inclusion, racial justice, how do you rewire it? I've talked with the mayor today, kind of bringing on various people to sort of, help explicate that part of the equation. Is there, how do I ask this politely, is there a kind of understanding in the other parts of the state that getting that equation right across the board for small businesses so that it's inclusive is a real priority, even if you're out of the city?
Well, I think there is. We certainly understand that in order to have a healthy Minnesota economy, we have to have a healthy Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we also have to have a healthy greater Minnesota. Part of the revitalization makes funds available to help rebuild those areas that were hurt by the riots last summer. But it is a statewide program as well, recognizing that we've got needs across the state. But we also have to look at the problems of Minneapolis in that we still have small businesses that are concerned about safety. We've got people in the Twin Cities that are reluctant to go to ball games or go to restaurants because they're worried about the safety of Minneapolis. And I think the mayor's done a good job of supporting the police. He needs a city council that's going to support the police as well and make sure that law enforcement is a top priority. If we really want to get investment back into the Twin Cities and into minority-owned businesses, we have to make safety a top concern.
Well, we'll leave it there. Senator Eric Pratt, who chairs the Jobs and Economic Growth Finance and Policy Committee, and he succeeded in getting the bill he authored, the Economic Growth Jobs and Economic Growth Bill, into law. I stand corrected on that. It's great. So, Senator Pratt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Joining me now is Mayor Jacob Fry of Minneapolis. The Minneapolis City Council has recently approved more than $100 million in pandemic relief funds. How are the city leaders planning to use some of that to support their small businesses? Let's find out. And with us, we've got Mayor with us right now. Mayor, it's great to see you. Look, Minneapolis, in just a very real way, has been ground zero for a lot of the stresses in this country across race, business, pandemic. You've had it all. Can you just give our audience kind of a quick snapshot of when it comes to small business recovery and getting everybody in an inclusive way in that equation, what's at the top of your list that has to happen to get out of being a story of being a victim of all of this and to now moving beyond that?
Steve, you're right, and thank you so much for having me here today. Minneapolis has been at the epicenter of a global reckoning around racial justice. And what we want to be working towards is not just getting back to normal, but blowing by it. We want to be pushing for full transformation in everything that we do. And so when we talk about these Rescue Act dollars and we talk about recovery, it's not just recovering, but it's pushing for a full-on transformation in terms of how we traditionally have done business, making sure that we're centering our BIPOC communities in our economic inclusion decisions, that we're making sure that people have stable and foundational assets like affordable housing, making sure that public safety is inherent regardless of what neighborhood you're in, and that we've got police reform that we're working on as well. So these are all things that we're working on. And as part of that $100 million that were passed in urgency, and we're proud to be one of the very first cities in the entire country to do so, we wanted to make sure that those three key assets, so it's about $37 million for economic inclusion with a focus really on small business. That's about $7 million or so for affordable housing. And then we've got about $12 million for public safety as well. These are all key areas that we need to be pushing for in the immediacy.
Mayor, when you're out in the community and you're meeting small business owners and minority-owned businesses, BIPOC owned businesses. What are you hearing from them that they most need in this time? What kind of support? What does that support look like beyond the dollars?
I don't think any small business is created exactly the same, nor are they experiencing the same elements within the city. That being said, I think there's a few key pieces that they're asking for. The first is they want to have those foundational aspects that are necessary for any business set up from the get-go. That means safety. Workers need to be able to head into their business and feel safe. Customers and patrons need to be able to go and shop and have both the reality and the perception of safety. That's a critical component. They're also asking for capital that is flexible. All of these businesses are experiencing an array of different difficulties. Some of them need to get their awning fixed. Some of them need a facade improvement. Some of them need to buy a new mop basin. All of these things end up adding to the expense that they're experiencing. And that expense is only compounded after a pandemic, after some of the unrest that we saw after George Floyd's murder. And these are things that we need to be helping out with. And so that's how we've structured the money. We've made sure that it's flexible. We've made sure that it's getting out urgently to those that need it most. And we're making sure that it's pressed out in a way that we can jumpstart our economy and revitalize our city.
Look, part of the story, unfortunately, of minority-owned business and the lack of racial justice we've had in this country is a lot of people have been excluded. You know, the City Council of Minneapolis has approved $100 million of pandemic relief funds. You want to focus $37 million of that in small businesses. Are there things that, about wiring in, particularly minority-owned businesses and small businesses, that where Minneapolis can look at from being ground zero of this story to being ground zero of the next story, that we're now going to do it better than other cities, that they're going to be kind of economic equation there that will make other cities envious? I mean, I know that's a big question, but you have to have sort of an aspiration when you're looking out. What is Mayor Frey doing on that front?
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth on that front. And one of the first steps was not just making decisions ourselves, but making sure that we are listening to a series of Black and brown leaders, by the way, 3 of whom I believe are on a panel coming up just shortly here between Kenya McKnight Ahad and Henry Jimenez and R.T. Ryback. I mean, these are all people that helped out substantially on the Minneapolis Forward Community Now Coalition, which was built to make sure that Black and brown leaders and community members were not just individuals that had a seat at the table, but were also key beneficiaries in this process. And so that Minneapolis Forward Coalition came forward with a series of recommendations. It would take hours to get into all of them, but I'll focus on just a couple here. One of the key pieces that they said was that we need Black ownership. And not just ownership of the business, but ownership of the underlying real estate. Because here's the way, as you mentioned, that we are going to blow by the old normal, and we're going to blow by the way that other cities have done things in the past. We're going to make sure that not only these Black and brown business owners own their own business, but they own the underlying real estate, so that when we see gains from the economy, when those values get increased, these business owners that have helped make these neighborhoods and corridors wonderful to begin with don't get the boot because the rent gets jacked up. Rather, they'll reap the benefits of those gains in equity. They can pour those gains back into their business, making them even more successful, and in turn pour those benefits back into the community itself. And so we've put, at this point, millions and even tens of millions of dollars into this commercial property development fund that is specifically geared towards helping these BIPOC community members purchase their own business and real estate. And we're going to make sure that that happens along some of these major corridors that were tragically hardest hit by COVID-19.
Just real quick before we take an audience question, I think the other thing is about the psychology of the city. You talk about the panel coming up, and I really look forward to speaking with them. and you I've been out to Minneapolis with you before. I guess the question is everybody on board in this city, or are there folks that are holding out that look at the course that you and your colleagues and council members have set up on rebuilding and reinvesting? I'd just like to know, are you all united, or are there some real problems in bringing around some other stakeholders in the city?
Well, I think there's never a unanimity of opinion, but what I've gathered is that throughout our city, there is a collective sense of urgency to do things differently. There is this notion that, through all of this crisis that we've experienced, all these crises that have been sandwiched on top of one another for this last year, that we're seeing every day as an opportunity. And someone said to me just yesterday, it was actually Jonathan Weinhagen, who's also on the Minneapolis Forward Coalition, that, we've been talking about how this last year has been unprecedented, and that's true. But this last year has also been remarkable. It's been remarkable to see how people have stepped up, stepped out, in some cases just come out of the woodwork to get our city through this. I think that's inspiring. And right now, as I mentioned, there is this collective sense of urgency to push back on all of these systemic inequities that have been here for decades, for generations, even hundreds of years. And now's the opportunity. We want to be that example for other cities to follow throughout the country. If there's something that we would want 5 and 10 and 20 years down the road, it's the ability to look back and say, you know what, we didn't get it right. We had been falling short, but we made the necessary changes, and we were an example for others to follow.
That's great. Mayor, we have a question from our audience from Russ Adams. Russ?
I'm Russ Adams. I'm the manager of Corridor Recovery Initiatives for the Lake Street Council. My question is related to that vital commercial corridor. It's been estimated that in order to reconstruct, repair, and rebuild along Lake Street, it will cost more than $250 million. Where will that money come from?
So the question was about Lake Street specifically, which was one of those corridors that was both hardest hit by the pandemic, as well as the unrest following George Floyd's murder. We have put in a substantial amount of money prioritizing areas like East Lake Street through a combination of the American Rescues Act, and there's tens of $millions in that fund, and there will be even more as we allocate the remaining $270 million. We've allocated city money to make sure that the buildings can get rebuilt as quickly as possible, that the facades can be improved, that the area has lighting and trash cleanup and all of the other facets that we know that will help to stabilize and then transform these corridors. We also have some state money that's in there as well. And so it's really a combination of city, state, and federal money that'll be streaming into areas like East Lake Street. And I'm excited. It's going to be tough. It has been tough. It will continue to be difficult. But you know what? We have a whole lot of people rallying around a common cause right now. And that cause is transformation. That cause is making sure that we're, walking and chewing gum at the same time and working on different projects that can help to benefit. One great example that I think Russ is actually familiar with is this notion of rebuilding resilient. We want to make sure that the new buildings that go up are not just economically beneficial, but are environmentally sustainable. We want to be reducing our collective carbon footprint. We want to enable these businesses to reduce their energy output. That's part of the work that we have underway right now. And the program was so successful that we actually doubled it through the American Rescue Act itself. And so that's just one example of many. And, I know, Russ is also the work around affordable housing is also key and foundational. And we've been putting quite a bit of resources into making sure that we've stabilized our communities that are experiencing homelessness, making sure that we provide that next rung on the ladder so they can pull themselves out. And then we're investing record amounts of money into affordable housing. And there's a dearth of it nationwide, and Minneapolis is no exception.
Well, thank you for that. And I should say that's Russ Adams, who is manager of the Corridor Recovery Initiatives of the Lake Street Council. Thank you for that question. So Mayor Jacob Frey of City of Minneapolis, thank you so much. It's always great to talk to you. Good luck on these big plans.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thanks for the conversation.
And now it's time for the Sponsor Perspective session of this program. Please welcome Lori Nordquist, Central Lead Region President for Wells Fargo, Consumer and Small Business Banking, and Alfredo Martel, CEO of the Metropolitan Economic Development Association. Over to you.
Well, it's great to be here today, and thank you for that introduction, Steve. So let's jump right in. So Alfredo, over the past 50 years, I know MEDA has provided assistance to more than 23,000 businesses owned and managed by entrepreneurs of color. And your organization to me is such an excellent example of how impactful CDFIs can be to diverse small business in communities like Minneapolis. So as you think about helping small businesses persevere during the pandemic, what have you had to adapt or do differently to meet those demands during these very challenging times?
Well, thanks, Lori, and thanks for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our story and our partnership with you and Wells Fargo, of course. A CDFI, let's just begin there, right? Community Development Financial Institution. We are a network of mission-driven small banks, if you would, who are driven primarily by our mission. We are nonprofit organizations that are embedded and deeply connected in the communities that we serve. In the case of MEDA in particular, over our 50-year history, we've focused on 3 fundamental areas of support to BIPOC entrepreneurs. These are the 3 most common and challenging obstacles that a BIPOC entrepreneur faces. Number 1 is access to management consultancy or management support. It's one thing to be excellent at drywall or running a restaurant or being a chef. It's a very different thing to run the business of a drywall company or run the business of a restaurant. Second, we provide access to markets and we provide access to contracts, whether they're state or corporate contracts. And then the final, of course, the obvious one is access to money, capital. Capital is one of the fundamental needs that BIPOC entrepreneurs don't have access to. So CDFIs fulfill that role in providing that source of capital. In the case of 2020, clearly the pandemic hit BIPOC entrepreneurs and BIPOC small businesses in an inordinate level of intensity for various reasons. Number 1, many BIPOC entrepreneurs were already operating with weak balance sheets or weak operating expenses and profits. But then the second one is the sectors. The sectors that got really affected by the pandemic, predominantly retail, food and beverage. Some of these sectors tend to be heavily BIPOC in terms of the diversity of the operators. So our clients were in those sectors that when the shutdown started, they were keenly affected by that. And then of course, SBA, PPP processes were a little bit challenging in the beginning, particularly when it came to providing CDFIs access to those funds and those deployments, which I know we're going to talk about the Open for Business initiative, which is a remarkable move to address this opportunity. And so finally, 72% of our clients, case in point, right now are stating that capital is their number 1 need in terms of what they would seek and need most for recovery and retooling. We know slowly the economy, slowly the country's reopening. We're not fully there yet. We're hopeful, but we know that recovery is slowly happening, but retooling for the new normal will also come. So capital, incredibly important in this stage of the game. I would say, in retrospect, flipping the script, maybe, Lori, how do you see large-scale institutions? We have an incredible partnership, and we rely on our partnerships with philanthropic, banking, and state organizations. How would you see large-scale organizations joining the fight, and what could they specifically help us address?
Well, it's such a great question, Alfredo. And, I really believe if we're going to achieve an inclusive economic recovery, we're going to need everybody, everyone's commitment and effort. I can speak specifically for Wells Fargo, and we've been dedicated to supporting small businesses for many years. But I think as we looked at the devastation that the pandemic was causing, we really said we have to do more in order to help small businesses keep their doors open and really weather the storm. And none of us knew how long that storm was going to be. So we created the Open for Business Fund. It's taking roughly $420 million in processing fees that we earned from the Paycheck Protection Program in 2020. And it's donating those dollars to nonprofits and CDFIs that serve diverse small businesses. And so far, we've already helped over 35,000 small businesses, and that's maintaining about 90,000 jobs. And of course, the majority of those are diverse-owned small businesses. The Open for Small Business Fund is based on 3 foundational strategies, and they really mirror what you were talking about as you help through MEDA. Access to capital is critical, especially for people of color and women. So the first strategy for Open for Business has been to collaborate with CDFIs to really reach what I would say is the smallest of small business owners with capital, emergency grants, and low-cost loans. Second, technical training is key, as you mentioned. So many small business owners need to rethink their business model to really meet the changing demands of this pandemic market. And I think the market's changed permanently in many cases. So we want to make sure we're helping build capacity for nonprofits that provide those technical assistances for things like business planning, financial planning, marketing, whatever it might be. And then finally, really providing longer-term recovery and resiliency resources so that the small business sector is really set up for long-term success and that we're working to remove really systemic barriers of growth. I'm really excited about the Open for Business Fund. It's really been designed to do incredible work through nonprofits and CDFIs like you. And in fact, I'm really excited today to share that Wells Fargo is announcing $12 million in philanthropic capital to bring new dollars to small businesses in the city of Minneapolis, as well as in the state of Minnesota. So really excited about that, and specifically includes a $3.5 million grant to MEDA. And I can't wait to see how you'll make an impact with those funds, Alfredo.
Thank you so very much, Lori. And we're privileged to have you as a partner in this last grant for $3.5 million. Remarkable, but it's really a reflection of our remarkable partnership that we've had for decades with Wells Fargo. Certainly appreciate it. And I would say that it mirrors a track record that started, I'll go back to 2016, where we received an operating grant and a PRI, which was help fund our operation and fund our lending capacity in 2016. In 2018, Wells Fargo's $1.5 million grant for banking technology was a game-changing tool during 2020 and the pandemic. And now this grant allows us to really scale our lending capacity. So the track record in the last activities between Wells Fargo and MEDA is a strong partnership. And Lori, on behalf of all of us, we really, truly thank you. You are making us so much better and helping us make such a difference.
Well, we're really excited. Just the possibilities on what you're going to be able to do to really bring hope and help to small businesses in our community. So, hey, Alfredo, I have to say congratulations on your 50-year anniversary and launching your new ambitious strategic plan, MEDA Vision 2025. We look forward to seeing just how you're going to bring the plan to life to support entrepreneurs of color and the communities that you serve. So, well, that's all the time we have today, Alfredo, but thank you so much for joining me. And I wish you and MEDA the very best success as you continue to do such important, critical work here in Minneapolis.
Thank you, Lori. Much appreciated. Let's go get it done.
Lori, Alfredo, Thank you so much. Great conversation. Would have liked to have even heard more. So thank you very much. My next guests are working to rebuild Minneapolis businesses and support their communities in an effective and equitable way. R.T. Ryback, he's a cool dude. He's the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, which has established the Restore, Rebuild, and Reimagine Fund to help renew key cultural corridors across the Twin Cities. He's also a former mayor of Minneapolis. Aren't we lucky to have him? Henry Jimenez is the executive director of the Latino Economic Development Center, or let me get this right, LEDC. LEDC is a community development financial institution that equips Latino entrepreneurs with skills and financial tools they need to be successful. And as we just heard from the mayor now, Kenya McKnight-Ahad is the founder and CEO of Black Women's Wealth Alliance, a small business which focuses on advancing economic stability and prosperity for Black women entrepreneurs and workers. It's great to be with all of you. Kenya, I'm going to just ask you real quick, and everyone, we're going to kind of work around the room here, and you guys all can respond to each other. But the mayor said the most important thing for him as he was approaching, the needs in Minneapolis, the needs for small business, particularly businesses owned by people of color that had not always been basically given the same opportunities as a lot of other businesses. And he said the most important thing is to listen and to build with other folks. Is the mayor listening to all of you?
He is listening. He's got a lot of listening to do from a whole bunch of ears. But I say from the business community, the mayor's been a great partner in understanding the priorities that we've set out. I work in a coalition with Henry, with the mayor, to set priorities for entrepreneurs of color around owning real estate, around being supported in their recovery efforts, to not only purchase land, but to rebuild land, to remodel their spaces, to get technical support from legal to accounting, et cetera. And the mayor has put forth a proposal to the city council to finance the priorities that our coalition laid out.
Well, thank you. Henry, let me ask you, when it comes to Latino-owned businesses and just businesses, in general, your area has been, faced with so many different challenges within such a condensed period of time, that I want to kind of give our audience a while. We've got great graphics behind us, and I'm an enthusiastic guy. The terrain is a tough one for a lot of businesses. What do they most need? What are you finding if you're going to go change the circumstances? We talk about it sometimes too casually, but what do businesses out there, particularly minority-owned businesses, really need to function so that they don't need as much and they're in a much healthier vector?
Thank you, Steve. I also want to answer that the mayor is listening, and so is the governor and the Senator Pratt. Legislature is listening. Our communities have been listening much longer, though, and they've been talking to these legislators and mayors and governors across the country for as long as we all have been here. So I just want to make sure that that is stated. I also want to say that what a Latino business needs, it's the same thing as any other business needs are. Everybody needs access to capital and technical assistance and the support both of the community but of their government. And how can they make sure that they establish a strong business plan and execute it? Those needs are the same. However, we all know that there's been systemic barriers that has made it difficult for the very same type of ideas for a Latino entrepreneur to potentially access the same type of capital at a traditional institution.
Well, thank you. RT, I know you've been working for a long time with the foundation and others across many different, I hate to call them lines in communities, but there are lines, there are, different quadrants there. You're a melting pot guy. I know there's this video out there that the Star Tribune pointed to, and you made a comment that said there, features several entrepreneurs who come from, immigrants into the community. And I guess my question is, and I don't know how to frame this exactly right, but I know you've raised money, you're addressing these issues. I just want to know, is gravity taking us in the right direction? And we don't need your foundation, we don't need all the money and support you're doing, or is it a tough lift? Like, what's the gap in terms of getting a community on the right track and a healthy track that's inclusive, that's respectful, where civic and social justice are built in, and that's what you're trying to coax along? Or is that just a hard thing to do that's going to require a lot more attention, a lot more support, and a lot more resources? Does that make sense?
Gravity implies that a lift is needed, and sure there is, but I also think that one of the things to remember is to remove barriers. A barrier-free world, one without the barriers that have kept people from succeeding as much as they deserve to be, is also part of the goal. So, like, I grew up in a family, my dad was white, ran a drugstore in a neighborhood where we depended on Black customers and Black doctors bringing their prescriptions into our drugstore next to an African-American grocery store. Over time, that neighborhood right near Lake Street became one that had many more businesses that succeeded because we removed some barriers. That included the idea which building owners rented to whom, our 2% loan program at the city. Later on, when we had lots of people from the Islamic community, primarily Somalis, opening business, we referred loans to be fit, prevented them. This incredible collection home ownership gap, and that's certainly what small businesses use for equity and moving forward with that. So what we need right now is to remove barriers, and because of what's happened in the community, we needed, for instance, the public to do much more rebuilding for the destruction. Only 40% of it was covered by the didn't designate a single dollar specifically to help those businesses of color destroyed after George Floyd's murder. We're going to access those dollars, but I think it's painful. And so, yeah, our foundation is money just out in loans. Businesses, they have great right now, and we need to be more in grants right now.
Well, thank you for that, Mayor Ryback. And I think we've heard most of it. I think there's a couple of internet issues that I think mostly we got this. But let me ask you a question, Kenya. I've been looking at your Twitter feed.
Is it my coverage? Should I move?
No, you're great. You're just. I just want to mention our audience with, and we got most of it. Kenya, I've been looking at your Twitter feed, and you just announced that you folks have a new piece of real estate, a new building that you've come into, that you've put various Black-owned businesses in it, and you're really trying to change the vector. And I'm interested in this dynamic of, like, what do you think when it comes to the Black Women's Wealth Alliance, when it comes to small business, when it comes to community? What is the process of getting businesses on their feet so that but then also taking that step and selling what inclusion matters so that you get mutual support from other communities, so that we're not just doing each other's laundry, and that we are in fact seeing mutual growth and mutual concern in a community, and that you put wealth and wealth creation in some part of the middle of that?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. For us, it's complex, right? Because we're dealing with a very historical context that is different than every community here. And so we have to do more deep investment in the financial trauma that Black folks have experienced from this country and continue to. So for us, it is not just about the business, it's about the person that's operating the business. It's a holistic approach. And so it's about stabilizing the individual in order to stabilize the business, right? So we're talking about making sure folks have enough money to pay their bills, enough money to take care of a good quality of life for themselves and their families before we can even get to really focusing on the business stability. And with the business, we have to think about strategy, helping us realign or just align our business to market opportunities because we're typically locked out of the bigger markets. So we tend to do business with ourselves, which doesn't sell as much. And so we need, support to access broad retail and other markets. And so, developing our products in that way, our branding. And so there's a lot of grant support needed at that level. It isn't just education. It isn't just the technical support, but there's a whole conversion process that's needed from, helping us transition from being sole proprietors to actual employers, where we're actually working for our own companies and able to hire folks and provide them with salary opportunities so that people can have stable income to actually build on a foundation to begin wealth, understanding that their business is also a wealth tool. But the first number one thing, again, going back, is really stabilizing the individual. And that is something that we know. It's something we do in our work. We see the impact of that. And when the person is stable, then what they do has more stability to it.
Well, thank you. Henry and RT, all of you actually, but I'll start with Henry. I am interested in the extraordinary level of unreported innovation that's going on at the smallest level of ventures. There's a lot going on out there that is not on the radar screen. When we talk about small businesses, we're talking about small businesses at a certain level, but there's a lot of things that are going on online. There are new, ways in which people have pivoted in this crisis to come along. And a lot of that story is a good story that I think has not been told. But I'm just interested, what I find when I talk to these folks is that there are sometimes financing challenges. There are, just how to do it challenges, or who challenges, or figuring out regulatory frameworks within a community or city. Does the LEDC and does the Minneapolis Foundation, which has resources, are they out there with mentors? Are they out there helping to provide? Because it's not just giving businesses money, it's giving businesses, models to replicate. And I'm just wondering how much of that we should be talking about. Henry?
Yeah, well, I want to make sure that your viewers know that when you're an immigrant, Latino entrepreneur, you already have to be innovative to try to navigate systems that don't work for you. So there's already a natural innovation happening there. I do want to thank the Minneapolis Foundation, Wells Fargo, because they provided funding for LEDC to just say, hey, we know it's an emergency mode, so we know that you're working with folks. Just do what you need to do to support these Latino entrepreneurs. And at a time of emergency, I don't think that we had the opportunity to be told, this is exactly how you're supposed to do it. Just let the folks that already know how to do this, do it. And I feel like the Latino entrepreneurs, not just here in the Lake Street corridor, but in the state, we're having to figure out, okay, how do I keep my business solvent? How do I make sure that I follow guidelines, but still be able to open and be sustainable to feed my family? And so I would say that innovation has been happening before the pandemic. And I think that is why it's so important to invest. And I don't like when government says, oh, we're going to give small businesses grants or forgivable loans. We should be talking about investing in our community. We're investing when we provide a $10,000 grant, that's an investment on a community that's clearly growing in the state of Minnesota. So I think these investments are important for a time where folks are being the most innovative because they're being allowed to be. And if I can add a little bit more, this is the perfect time for state and federal government to really rethink their processes. I think people are listening, but the systems are still the same. The budgetary systems are still the same. Rethink procurement process, rethink the HR process, because that is how you're going to start really tapping into these innovative new wave of Minnesotans. And many, by the way, we should also stop calling new Minnesotans, because I could tell you that my daughter and my son, they know nothing but Minnesota. They are Minnesotanos, and that is where we need to invest.
That's very cool.
And if I can just add, because I know RT wants to jump in, is that, I would say that we're seeing an insurge of new business startups in the Black community. Black women have already been leading new business startups across the country. And Black entrepreneurs across the country has really, we created more businesses under the pandemic than we have in the past 20 years. And so we just increased that again. And so I think the innovation continues as, you all know historically that we've been innovative the whole time in creating a lot of the infrastructure of this country. So this has continued and we've seen it. What we haven't seen, though, is a lot of emphasis supporting Black businesses specifically. We know there's resources directed, but it's not hitting us. We're not seeing a lot of resources in our community that's getting to the entrepreneurs. We're seeing a lot of education, a lot of mentor, but we're not seeing direct resources that get to the people on the ground. And we need to see more of that. And we do need more opportunities to, reform policies, processes, structure. Like the roof has to come off of everything for sure at this point.
Kenya, before I jump, I'm going to give Art. I apologize. I'm going to give RT the last word in a moment, but I want to ask you one other quick question, Kenya. I know that I've read that your PPP experience and whatnot was a good one, and part of that was a relationship with your financiers, with your bank, that had been part of that equation. My equation is, I think there are a lot of other people you're talking about that may not have those same kind of relationships, may not have those kind of habits.
Correct.
And so I'm always interested, not the boutique story. I want to know the story that can be copied and replicated by other people that are coming along, as you just said. So just real short form, are you helping other people to understand how to do what you did?
it takes resources. I mean, yeah. I'm an exception, but I'm not the rule, right? I've worked in community for 20 years. I've had access to a lot of information and knowledge and people that the average person doesn't. So I understand and know how to navigate and work with folks, and that worked to my favor. And I worked in business before I was an entrepreneur and doing this work. And so that isn't available to everyone, but it does take a level of resource to help convert, as I converted from a sole proprietor to now an employer where I work for the company and hire other people. So that level of resource investing in systems really matters to help make that access key. But we're working on that in our work, but it needs to be something that folks specifically focus on when they're talking about micro business, sole proprietors. That conversion is critical.
Thank you. RT, I'm going to give you the last word. You can respond to any of this, but when I was in Minneapolis in the past and you and I spoke, one of the things that struck me about your work in the foundation and what you're trying to do is to impact people's consciousness so that there's empathy, so there's mutual concern, so that there's concern about how others are growing and doing. We have that in our program today. But I want to ask you, I know the real world is more complex than that. Do you think, particularly in a place like Minneapolis, that we're getting to a point where not only with what you're trying to do with building capacity and providing resources, are you seeing a shift so that citizens in this area are themselves committed to diversity and inclusion, are committed to kind of, social justice being embedded in economic? I mean, that may be a heavy question, but I know that you think about those things.
I think our city has been through a heck of a lot over the year and a half, but I also believe we are moving toward a place in spite of and because of this panel, okay? When I was mayor, both Henry and Kenya advised the city, and that helped a lot. Now the tables are turned. I lead a 103-year-old foundation that was built on really well-intentioned white power, looking to ways to give money to help people of color with a rigid theory of here's what we think is going to work. If you agree, we'll give you money. Very different now. Step number one is I brought in a person who is much more proximate, Shonda Smith-Baker, to lead our impact. I follow her lead, and we follow the lead of Kenya and Henry. We don't say, if you do things the way we think, we'll give you. We say, tell us how to address these issues, maybe different perspectives we have, and then we will ideally support that. We're doing a build street from the one Kenya built in partnership with the Rose Phillips Family Foundation, which is a foundation representative. The thing is, foundations created a building that's 100% about Black-owned businesses and creating equity. So the ownership of the building will turn over to the contractor, developer, to key tenants and investors. All the businesses will be Black-owned in that, and that's part of one thing. In addition, along with the innovation that both Henry and Kenya are doing, we work with a very established group, Greater MSP, representing all the CEOs, that has created a way to open up their supply chains and now $1 billion to small businesses. And that's focusing now even more on emerging businesses of color. That sort of work about breaking down barriers of foundations, about business organizations, is not about figuring out how do we lift up groups that have been innovating within their own cultures for generations. It's how to really create an equitable place where people can succeed. The natural order is for everyone to succeed. What's happened in our country is we're recognizing barriers were put up. The owners, the contractor on that building, talked about families from Tulsa. They lost property in the destruction of Black Wall Street. 3 generations later, in Minneapolis, on Broadway Avenue, they will be restoring equity that they should have had all along. That's removing a barrier. That's not swooping white saviors and saying, hey, we have a great idea to lift you up to where we are. We're creating something new here. I don't know where the heck it's going to land, but it's a lot better than we're restoring and we're rebuilding, but we are reimagining.
Well, RT, I really appreciate the scaffolding and framing you brought to that. I think it's so important. RT Ryback, CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, former mayor of Minneapolis, Henry Jimenez, executive director of Latino Economic Development Center in Minneapolis, and Kenya McKnight Ahad, so cool to talk to you, founder of the Black Women's Wealth Alliance, Health and Wealth together. Thank you both, all three of you, for joining us today. Outstanding conversation, and good luck with all of your great work.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. A big thank you to Wells Fargo for its support of this program, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we're going to put these great conversations up on our website shortly, and you can go back and rewatch them, which I'm going to do as well. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.